Welcome to Cycle Sports Radio. I am Pat Harris, your host, and I am, of course, the executive producer of Cycle Sports TV. You can find us at cyclesportstv.com. You can also find us on YouTube at youtube.com/cyclesportstv. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook and probably just every other social media outlet you could possibly imagine. But today, what we're going to be talking about is suspension. It's one of those things that most people, even guys that have been riding for 25 years, have no clue. So what I did is I brought in the big guns. Today we have author of the Total Control and co-author of the Suspension Bible. I mean, how much better do you get than the Suspension Bible? Lee Parks, who has been doing this for a very long time, and trust me, folks, he knows his stuff. So Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pat. Happy to be here.
And Lee, you could explain it best. Why don't you tell a little bit about people how you got into the sport of motorcycling?
Well, I was very lucky. My father rode, and against the better judgment of my mother, he convinced her that at 12 years old, I should get to start riding dirt bikes. So I was very fortunate. I got to do that. Started when I was 12. When I was 14, I started racing. I grew up in the Midwest, so believe it or not, that was ice racing on the frozen lakes of the Midwest.
Oh, I just got a chill.
Yes, exactly. Which later turned into motocross racing, and then in college, I actually switched over to road racing, which I found I was much better at than either of the other two.
So you didn't even start road racing until you got into your, late teens, early 20s?
Yeah, I was 19 when I started road racing, and 14 when I started doing the off-road stuff, which was actually a really good way to do it, because getting experience off-road without traffic and cars and all the sort of things that you can't control out on the road is a much better way to learn on smaller, lighter bikes where you can make more mistakes and not pay as big a penalty for them.
And you started out racing 125s in AMA, correct?
Yeah, when I got into road racing, when I turned professional, that was in 1994, I raced in the AMA Superbike Championship in the 125 GP class, which was the first year that it started that. Gotcha.
Now, when was it, in your experience, that you started realizing how important the bike suspension was to your riding and to your ability to ride fast?
It was actually that year. Up until that point, I had never really given it too much attention. And then once you get a motorcycle that has as much horsepower as your competitors, if guys are still beating you, then you start saying, okay, well, what else is it that that they have that I don't? And turned out that suspension was really the big thing. There's only so much you can do in terms of braking. There's only so much you can do in terms of horsepower. Even mid-corner speed, the tires are really the limiting factor in that. And once you get good enough, there's only so fast you can go in the middle of the corner. So really the suspension is what enables you to get in and out of that faster, as well as even have more mid-corner speed by being able to keep the wheels in constant contact with the road.
Now, you wrote the book, and you wrote this book quite a few years ago, Total Control, which is really, to me, is the best book for anybody to go out for any type of street riding, even if you do track days or if you don't do track days. Some of the other books are specifically for the track or this really covers everything. But one thing that you're going to notice in this book is that there are 2 chapters on suspension. Now, I'm this guy, I've been riding for 20 years. I just went out and spent $30,000 on a Ducati Panigale, and this is an amazing motorcycle. It's got all this great new suspension, Öhlins, this. Why do I have to do anything to my suspension?
Well, and you're a good person to ask that question.
I'm the perfect person for that, right?
Because at least for our viewers, we'll notice you are not an average-sized person.
No.
And for that matter, what is an average-sized person? And that's going to be different in Japan than it is here, than it is in other places. And so, the one thing that the engineers that design any motorcycle don't know is who the person is that's going to buy it. And so, while when it comes to things like horsepower, you just want as much as possible that you can control. Same thing with brakes. You want as much stopping power as you can control. When it comes to suspension, it's a little bit different because there are different needs for different types of riders, different weights of riders, especially when you get into things like luggage or passengers. Those needs change as well. And so since they don't know the answers to any of those, they've got to compromise and put some sort of a setup out there, one that they think is going to be for whatever they call the average rider. And then, of course, there's also cost constraints and
Yeah.
Like anything else, as you spend more money, you can get better quality stuff. So certain things are done just to keep costs in line as well.
So really, you can improve the quality of the components, but they're still guessing as to who's going to be riding it. And that's the thing is, if for me, and we talked about that, I'm 280 pounds. There is no bike made, regardless of expense or size, that is set for me. And certainly they don't know my riding style, slow and sloppy. Anyway. But
Are we talking about you or your riding style?
yeah, exactly.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
yes, exactly.
Yes.
But but the reality is that I know no matter what I buy, I have to go in and have a bike resprung and have the damping changed. Because obviously when the spring rates change, you have to change the damping, and we'll explain that why in a second. But why? Tell us why somebody my size, I go on again, I'm going to buy a bike that some people, a guy that's 120 pounds is going to go, this bike is really stiff. I'm going to get on it and it's going to be undersprung. What is that and what does it affect?
Well, why is that is because, the thing that we use to control that are springs, and springs are very consistent, meaning they don't change, especially with modern metallurgy. The spring is going to be the same now as it is 10 years from now. But again, it's going to be optimized for a particular weight, because the spring is what separates you from the wheels in terms of how much resistance do we want there to be. And as we add more weight to it, you're going to need more resistance. As you take weight away, you're going to need less resistance. So if we put someone who weighs 100 pounds on the same bike that you're on, it's going to, if it's set up correctly for you, it's going to be way too stiff for them, and it's not going to be able to follow the curvature or the changes of the road, and they're going to be bouncing all over the place. Similarly, a bike that's set up for someone who's really light, you're going to get on it, and just sitting on it, you're going to come really close to completely compressing it. And so even a small bump can cause you to run out of suspension travel, which is not only uncomfortable, but when you run out of travel, that means you can no longer make any changes with the road surface, and so it's going to be very easy for the bike to slide out or to crash at that point.
Well, and a perfect example is the Hyosung project bike that we have. When we first tested that bike for sag, when I sat on the bike, it had 78 millimeters of sag. Now, if people don't know where the range needs to be, it needs to be around 35, 33 for that bike.
Right, we should probably explain what sag is. Sag
Yes.
is how much, when you sit on the bike, the weight of the bike and the rider compress the suspension.
Compresses. Now, that bike has 110 millimeters of suspension travel. So I already took up 78 millimeters of that suspension travel just sitting on the bike. We figured out, just by quickly grabbing the lightest guy in the shop, that it was set perfectly for a guy not wearing gear of 118 pounds. So now, when we talked about it, I said, and I took that bike and I rode it on the track. Now, on the track, if it's a smooth track, okay, you might be able to get away with it if you're not pushing it really hard, but there are some real issues that can happen when the bike is undersprung or even oversprung. I mean, like I said, if you bottom out, there's no more suspension.
That's right. That means any other changes, you're going to lose traction. Whether the road goes from underneath you or comes up above, either way, you're going to end up running out of traction when you're in that position.
Now, one of the questions that I asked Paul Thied back when I interviewed him was, and I think a lot of people will think of this too, they'll think, well, I'm in a car. I buy a car, I don't have to change the spring rate on the car to adjust for me or for another passenger. Why would I have to do it for bike? Because I think people, they think, well, it should just be one spring rate and be able to handle it.
Right. Well, the big difference is if you look at the total weight of a car, you as a person, when you sit in that car, are adding a very small percentage to that weight.
Yeah.
Whereas there are motorcycles where you weigh more than the entire motorcycle does.
Absolutely.
So, and even for the bikes where that's not the case, even a really big heavy bike like a Goldwing or a BMW K1600, you're still a significant amount of weight as a percentage when you sit on that motorcycle.
Yeah.
And so whereas, even in the smallest, lightest car, you're not putting a really huge difference. Now, in a really lightweight race car, maybe, but a typical street car that you're going to be driving around, a really big person versus a really small person isn't going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, because if you have a 5,000-pound vehicle, it doesn't matter whether you're 100 pounds or 300 pounds. You're just it's a minute change in the overall gross vehicle weight of the vehicle. Now, we talked about sag a little bit. Want to explain why we need sag and why we need that percentage of sag that we talked about.
Okay, so as we said before, sag is how much the bike and the rider's weight compress the suspension when you're sitting on it. And really, when you first think about it, you would think, well, why would we want to give up a certain amount of that very precious resource of suspension travel,
Sure.
because that's what enables us to absorb bumps and keep it both safe and comfortable for us. But the problem is the road's not just full of bumps, it's also full of dips or depressions or holes like potholes. So when you go over a dip or say a pothole in the road, if you didn't have any sag, meaning when you sat on the bike, if it didn't compress some, there'd be nothing left when you went over the hole to drop into the hole. You would drop into the hole. So when you sit on the motorcycle, including your luggage, your passengers, or anything else that you have, however much that bike compresses when you sit on it, and remember, when you go around a corner, it's compressing even more. So the centrifugal force as you're going through the corner compresses that suspension even more. The amount that total compression is, both from your weight as well as any centrifugal force of going around the corner, that represents how much travel is going to be available to let that wheel drop into the hole. Because ideally, when we go over a hole, we want the wheel to drop in it. We don't want to feel ourselves and the rest of the bike dropping into it.
Yeah, because I guess the best example is if you ride if anybody ever's ridden a road bike, not a non-suspension mountain
Bicycle.
bike, just a regular bicycle, where when you go over a rough road, it's brutal.
Yeah.
And if you go over a rough road and try to turn, good luck on that.
Yeah, let alone you go over any kind of a pothole at all on a bicycle, you're probably going to end up, denting the rim, especially on a road bike.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. So we want to avoid that on a motorcycle because we're traveling at much higher speeds. And let's face it, if I want to go out and do a 500-mile ride, I want to be comfortable, but I also want to have some comfort, which is an issue that I think a lot of people think that the two things of having, and this is taught in your total control class, is that having...
You mean performance, not comfort.
Right. Meaning that you can have comfort and performance at the same time, meaning that you're not going to have... People think that, well, if the bike is set up to be able to ride hard or to be able to perform well in the turns, that it's not going to be comfortable, that it's going to be too stiff. That stiffness, having it, perform well under, a high performance riding, and also have enough plushness to give you comfort, that those two things are mutually exclusive. That the bike either has to be comfortable or it has to perform well. And that's not true.
Right. Well, the spring rates are based on your weight, and it doesn't matter if you're riding really hard or if you're riding really easy. It doesn't matter if you're on a touring bike or on a sport bike. There's a given spring rate that for the most part is going to work the best for your weight.
Yeah.
What will change depending on how you ride is the compression damping. In other words, the damping basically slows down the speed of the spring in either direction. So as you're going around a corner, if you're going really quickly like on a racetrack or in a canyon road and you're very, very quickly going around turns where there's going to be a little bit of a bump in it. Remember, if there were no bumps or dips in the road, we wouldn't even need suspension.
Exactly.
But since there are no roads quite like that, we do need suspension. And so as you're going faster and faster, you're going to want to have a little bit more resistance when you hit those bumps on the front end than you would if you were going slower. Otherwise, you'd run the risk of it bottoming out, compressing all the way. So that will change depending on how fast you're riding. And interestingly enough, rebound damping is exactly the opposite of that. So rebound damping is how quickly, once the suspension compresses, we allow it to decompress or extend. And as you go faster and faster, that means, think about as you're going up a bump, that we want the suspension to compress, not all the way to where it bottoms out, but where it's able to absorb the bump. But on the backside of the bump, we want it to extend back down the backside. Now, as you go faster, you want it to extend down quicker. But what do most people do is they get into more aggressive sport riding is they add more and more damping to the rear end, and in fact, they end up skipping over bumps. So it feels really good right up until you skip over a bump and start to slide because it wasn't able to react fast enough.
And if you hit enough bumps in a row, it's just going to pack that rear end down, and you said you're going to lose. And if, God forbid, that's in a corner, because now your tire is either lost a lot of its contact patch or all of it, which means it's something not too fun is going to happen.
Right. Exactly.
So the idea here is we want something that's between a pogo stick with no damping and something that just doesn't move quickly enough, which we've seen bikes, and you've tested them and I've tested them, that were set up so slow, that had so much damping that you wonder how they even rode the bikes.
Right. And even bikes that are adjustable, it doesn't mean that the range of adjustment is even going to be a usable range. For
Sure.
instance, you've seen, we've tested bikes where you could go from way too fast to still too fast.
Yeah.
Or you could go from way too slow to still very slow. And the entire range of adjustment is in the wrong place.
And that's the stock settings, too. That's basically
Right.
how the manufacturer made it.
Right, and generally that's an issue with the oil viscosity or the thickness of the oil.
Yeah.
So if they put too thin of an oil in, all the range of adjustment's not going to matter because even when you try to really restrict the flow, the oil is so thin it still bounces too much like a pogo stick. And
Yeah.
if they put too thick of an oil in, then even when you try to take all the restrictions out, the oil is so thick like it's molasses going through there.
Yeah.
It still can't react fast enough.
Yeah. Well, and we had I rode a bike. I had a friend of mine that wanted me to ride his bike. So I wanted to see how the suspension feels. He said, it's a stock suspension, but I had somebody set it up. As soon as they say somebody set it up, I went, okay. This is a stock R6. I already know it's undersprung for me. Yet,
Pretty much every bike is going to be undersprung for
me.
you.
Yeah, yeah. But I felt every bump in the road, every pebble. It was such a harsh ride. It was just, I don't even know how he rode it around like that. We wound up having to take over 20 clicks of compression damping out of the front forks and the rear shock just to get it to where it was compliant. I mean, it really was. It felt like as if there was a spring that was 5 times too stiff, because it was just that harsh of a ride. And that, again, it was undersprung, but it was still way over damped. So it did have the adjustment. Unfortunately, there was too much.
Right.
So, you got to be careful who sets up your suspension because they may say, oh, well, we're going to set it up for the track. What track? What track doesn't want to allow your suspension to move?
Right. Well, I think you should always treat anyone with suspect who says that suspension is just a black art that only special people can know.
Yeah.
That in fact, 90% of it is just very common sense, basic science that anybody with half a brain can learn in a
Yeah.
fairly short amount of time and at least understand philosophically what's going on, what direction they need to go, and so forth.
Because I learned it, and I have less than half a brain.
There you go.
But I think, and when we talk about,
I think 48% was where we're at the last
I
estimate.
think that's with the test. Yeah,
Yes,
that was the
yeah.
test. Yeah, we were at 48%. But so I'm right there.
Yeah.
I'm right there. So basically, what we have to worry about there's 3 different issues we have to worry about. We have to worry about our spring rates, so spring forces, and then we have to be able to deal with our damping, which is rebound and compression. But then there's also this little issue of friction. So there can be an issue where if you have excessive friction, then it can also affect how the suspension handles as well. Or
Correct.
how the bike
and,
handles.
And in fact, early motorcycles back in the 1920s and 1930s, they didn't have the modern suspension components that we have now. And so the damping was actually created purely by friction. They would take sort of rubber discs with metal, they would put little metal compressors on the outside, and by tightening them, they would add friction, and that friction would act to slow down the spring movement. Now, of course, very, very difficult to get anything consistent out of that. But,
Yeah.
that was purely using friction as a damping agent. Now we have much more sophisticated hydraulic suspensions where we can very precisely control oil, which is the medium that we use to restrict or to increase in terms of getting it to move the way that we want. And so nowadays we want to basically have as little friction as possible. So any of the sliding components, anything that's touching one another, we don't want there to be, ideally there would be no friction, with the exception of all of our nuts and bolts that hold everything together. There we want a tremendous amount of friction because
Sure.
we don't want those things to come out.
Yeah. Now, how does somebody go about testing this on their bike? They got their new bike. Now they realize, well, maybe I need to check this. How do you do that?
Well, the first thing to do, the most important part is definitely the springs. So
Yeah.
the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the spring rates are correct for your body type, or body weight, I should say. And there is no sort of these bikes are good or these bikes are bad. It's really going to depend, and front and rear may be different. You may have a front fork that's got a really good spring for you and a rear end that's terrible, or vice versa. So you really have to test each one independently. So the basic process that you go through is, and you'll usually need a couple of friends to help you with this, some extra food and beverages is not a bad idea to help get some friends.
A little payment, yeah.
That's right, to help come over and give you a hand with this. And of course, they'll probably want their bikes done too. So
Absolutely.
This is definitely a good way to sort of have a little suspension party.
Yeah.
But to figure out if the spring rates are correct, there's basically 3 measurements that you need to take. The first measurement is you need to get the suspension completely extended. Now, if you have a bike with a center stand, that's fairly easy. You put it on the center stand. If you rock the bike back so that the front tire is off the ground, now we can take a measurement from any part of the sprung mass. That's any part of the bike that moves, or any part of the bike that that doesn't move, against any part of the bike, the unsprung mass that does move. So in other words, you want all the things that move, like your wheel and your brakes, the lower part of your suspension measured against the upper part of your suspension or the frame, things that shouldn't move. And you take those two distances and you take a measurement. Doesn't matter where you take them on the forks. It can be anywhere on the upper tube to anywhere on the lower tube. On the rear suspension, it's from the middle of the rear axle to a point directly above it. Doesn't matter where that point is, so long as it's 90 degrees, directly above that. And for the rear suspension, you can rock it back to the front if you have a center stand, or if you've got a lighter bike like a sport bike or a dirt bike, you can rock it back on like a side stand if you've got that. Or if not, if you've got a big heavy bike with neither, get a couple of strong friends to help you lift it up and just hold it until you feel the suspension actually top out,
Yeah.
where it can't extend anymore. So you take that first measurement with the wheel completely off the ground between those 2 points. Then you put the rider on the bike, hands and feet on the bars and pegs, and then you'll have one person stabilizing the bike either from the front or the rear, depending on which end you're doing. So let's say we're measuring the front suspension. You'll have somebody stabilize the bike from the rear. That means they're not pushing or leaning it. They're just going to kind of keep it balanced there. A second person is going to compress the front suspension. This is easier if you have the rider hold the front brake on, or if you have the bike in a wheel chock. That makes it easy. Pull the suspension down and very slowly let it up.
And how far did they pull it down?
Just like half an inch, doesn't need to be very much.
Not very far.
Doesn't need to be very far. But you just need to get it into the spring, and then you want to very slowly let it up. The reason that you let it up very slowly is one of the problems with friction is that it's uncontrollable. And if you push the spring down and let it go, it's going to shoot up, and every time it's going to land in a different position because the friction is not controllable, it's not consistent. So if you push down and very slowly let it up, now whatever friction is in the system is going to keep it from extending up to its true position. Okay, now we're going to take that as a second measurement. The third measurement is we do just the opposite. We pull up in the suspension, we completely extend it, but with the rider on board, and now we slowly let it come down. Now whatever friction is in the system is going to keep it from extending down to its true position. Now if the bike had no friction, both those measurements would be the same, because essentially it's just the rider sitting on the motorcycle with somebody balancing it. So that should never be different. There will always be some difference, especially in the front suspension, because there is friction present. So the real number that we want to get to measure with is going to be halfway between those last two measurements. So you take that number, subtract it from the original number we had of the suspension completely extended, and that will tell you, in fact, how much the bike sags when the rider sits on it.
And to determine how much sag, because this is something we've talked about before, there's a percentage that we want, because even though I said with the Hyosung we wanted about 35 millimeters, it's more a percentage of the amount of suspension travel you have. So this number can vary from bike to bike, correct?
Right. So generally you want it between 28 and 33% of the total wheel travel. So the first thing you need to figure out is what is the wheel travel.
Sure.
If the bike is stock, you can just look that up in the owner's manual or a magazine review or the manufacturer's website. If it's not stock, you need to go whoever made those changes and find out, did they make it longer, did they make it shorter? In the cruiser world, you see a lot of guys lowering their bikes.
Yeah, and you can have 2.5 inches of travel.
Right, exactly. Some of the dirt bike guys actually raise them a little bit to get a little bit more, especially some
Yeah.
of the dual sport bikes that could use a little bit more travel. So anyway,
Sure.
Once you have that number, you multiply that number by approximately 0.3, and that will tell you how much you want it to sag when you sit on it.
So now we have a number that we can reach. There's a couple issues. We have different bikes, and again, we deal with this a lot with the classes, is that some of them are not adjustable externally.
Correct.
Okay, so how do we deal with that? Because I know there's a couple ways you could do it, but how do you get your sag set if I don't have any external adjustments?
All right, so if it's on the front suspension, if you're trying to set the sag and you don't have any adjustments, you can actually take the fork caps off and you can put little spacers inside, in between the spring and the fork cap. Longer spacer will compress the spring more. That will give it less sag. A smaller spacer will allow it to extend more, which will actually make it want to compress easier, which will give you more sag. And you can make those fairly cheaply. You can buy those from various companies, very inexpensively. You can even cut your own out of different types of stock. So that's a fairly inexpensive way to do that if your bike doesn't have the adjustments. On the rear suspension, if the shock is not adjustable for preload, which is spring tension or how much the spring is compressed, you're going to literally just have to replace the whole entire mechanism.
Yeah, there's an issue with that. That's a little tougher on the rear. But obviously, too, is if we get to a point and we measure it, like say, for instance, we're measuring the Hyosung. Okay, I'm going to use that as a perfect example. When I set on that, it's 78 millimeters of travel. I don't care how much spacer I use.
Right.
It's going to be the amount of preload I'd have to put in would be ridiculous. The spring would just be compressed to nothing. So at that point, we know we have to change spring rates.
Correct. Yeah. Preload is not the answer to all changes in terms of sag. It only gives you a very small usable range, out of which you need to get either a stiffer spring or a softer spring, depending
Yeah.
on which end of the range that you're at.
But luckily, there's actually an easy place to go figure out what spring rate you need.
Yeah, fortunately, you can go to racetech.com. They've got a great sort of calculator over there. You put in the bike, you put in your weight. It'll tell you exactly what kind of a spring you need.
So you really don't have to guess. And I think that's the big thing is people are worried that they're going to have to go. You don't want to guess at a spring rate, buy the spring and have it installed, pay for all that, and then go, oh, it's the wrong spring rate. So certainly they want to make sure that it's, because they go through all the engineering to figure out what spring rate's going to work.
And any suspension company, if you call them up and you tell them what you're riding, what kind of luggage you're going to have and so forth, will be able to recommend springs for you, based on their experience of,
Yeah.
of what you need.
And they're going to be able to set spring rates. Now, the part that is the variable is damping, because it's not, the damping, how the damping curves work is going to vary based upon your riding style as well, correct?
Right, exactly where it's going to be. The basic damping isn't going to change that much with riding style. It
Yeah.
will change somewhat, but
Yeah.
it's not going to change that much. The way to think about it is that the springs are based on your weight.
Yeah.
So you have to get the spring based on how much you weigh.
Yeah.
And remember, if you gain a lot of weight or lose a lot of weight, you are going to have to change springs at a certain point.
Absolutely.
Right. So damping, on the other hand, is related to the spring.
Yeah.
So even if your spring is not correct for your weight, you still need to match the damping to that spring, even though that spring may not be good for you. And when you
Yeah.
change a spring, you will have to change the damping. You will need more or less damping depending on what kind of a spring you put on.
Yeah.
But the damping is based on the spring that you're using. The spring is based on your weight. And then you have small adjustments in both spring preload or damping amount based on riding style and what you're doing. But those changes are smaller than you would think.
Yeah. Well, and I know that having the proper valving, because they dealt with this with the ZRX, that unfortunately where the clicks were, one click was a little bit too much, and then go down, and it was a little, it was too little. So it needed to be in the middle, but there was no way to put it in the middle. But until we changed the valving curves on it, and they went in and redid the valving, and then perfect. So, but you can actually have it to where, especially in the stock setups, to where there is no perfect place to put it. It's kind of either too much or too little.
Right. In fact, when I was racing 125 GP bikes, I think back then I was about 155 pounds, but I think those bikes were made more for 120-pound
Oh, yeah.
people. And so we had the opposite problem. Each of the adjustments of the damping was too small.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get big enough changes. So we changed the valving so that each click would be a bigger change.
Yeah.
That would be more of a meaningful range for someone of my weight.
Yeah, because those bikes, let's face it, most of the people that start on those bikes were a lot younger than you. They're barely breaking into racing, and they're 16 or 18, whatever it needs to be. And most racers are kind of small, if you've noticed that.
In fact, that bike weighed about the same that I did.
Yeah.
So that should give you an idea.
Yeah, we wouldn't.
Lighter even than dirt bikes.
Who
you
needs
know.
a ramp? Just pick it up and throw it in the back
Exactly.
of the truck, right?
That's true. We never did bring ramps with those bikes
Just lift it up.
for those reasons. Yes.
It's just about the same weight as a dirt bike, I think.
Even lighter, actually. Yeah.
So now, the people are going to listen to some of this stuff and go, okay, great advice, sounds wonderful. There's no way I'm going to be able to do this. What kind of resources are out there for people for references, and I think we mentioned a couple here, but for references for people to learn how to be able to do this stuff themselves and to know what they're doing when they make their adjustments.
Sure. Well, I'll start with shameless plugs. So,
Yes, there you
of
go.
course,
Well,
Total
that's why I set
Control.
you up. Total, yes.
And,
Total Control.
Yes, Total Control, as well as Race Tech's Motorcycle Suspension Bible. Total Control has all the basics in it. That's actually a riding skills book, but we do
Yeah.
have 2 chapters on all the basics of suspension. The Suspension Bible, as its name suggests, is sort of the comprehensive resource for that. Any of the major suspension companies, obviously I worked with Race Tech when we did the suspension
Yeah.
book. They're fantastic. Any of the real major suspension companies, though, if you call them up, they know people have questions. But my best advice is learn as much as you can before you talk to any of these companies.
Yes.
Because that's how you're going to know whether or not they're being honest with you and whether or not they know what they're talking about. And just because some guy's out at a racetrack setting up bikes doesn't mean he knows anything about suspension. On the other hand, he may be very good. And I've seen both examples of that. People who are really fantastic and people who shouldn't even be allowed to own a set of wrenches that are out of the track.
Just walk away from
Yes.
walk away from the tools.
Right. So an
Yeah,
an
we've seen
educated
those guys.
consumer is always the best first step. And in in both those books, it'll give you a language you can use to be able to talk to a suspension technician
Yeah.
saying, I need more compression damping, or I need more high-speed compression damping, or I need more
Yeah.
or less rebound damping. And if the person that you're talking to doesn't know what you're talking about, that's probably not the person that you want to have
Yeah.
working on your bike. And sadly, a lot of the dealership technicians get virtually no training in suspension setup at all. They're taught how to assemble and disassemble them, how to put parts in them to replace them when they're bad, but they have very little understanding or experience in terms of how to set them up. So,
Which makes you even wonder when a bike comes out of the factory, when it comes out of the dealership, I should say. They do set assembly to these bikes. Where are these bikes even set? Is there even any consistency to how the bikes are set when they come out of a dealership?
not that I could really tell. A few bikes are set up really nice for, so for instance, let's take maybe a Suzuki GSXR sport bike.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the spring and damping rates on those are fairly close for kind of 160 to 180 pound
Yeah.
people, which are pretty typically who buys it.
Yeah.
If you fall outside of that range, it's going to be too stiff or too soft for you.
That's me.
Right? Like you, exactly. Bikes like Goldwings, for some reason, come undersprung for even a 100-pound woman. So I have no idea what they were thinking when they
Yeah.
came up with that. It's easily fixable, but those are not easy bikes to work on either. But I certainly wouldn't buy one of those without first fixing the suspension on it and getting that set up. And it really can transform a bike, especially something as big and heavy as a Goldwing. Can be just a completely different motorcycle. Not just that it has better performance, but literally that it can be quite a bit more comfortable.
And what we've seen is that the bikes that tend to react the best to suspension changes, because we already know that on sport bikes, they're already trying to make the bike perform, because they're going to be tested by magazines, they're going to go out there and they're going to be put on the track. They're already set up to test, to work well at a high rate of speed. But some bikes, even expensive bikes, aren't, and sometimes they seem to, it almost seems like the people that design the bikes don't know how suspensions work. Because you get some of these cruisers and some of these, I'm not even going to say the adventure rider touring bikes, because some of those are okay, but a lot of the cruisers seem to be way undersprung and way underdamped to where they almost feel dangerous.
Well, certainly the bikes that the cruisers that they aim towards women, rather than re-engineering the bike as something that's designed to work for someone who's lighter, they just take all the spring rate and damping out of these things, and they literally do become dangerous. I mean, those bikes need extensive work. Yes, we'd all like to have our feet flat on the ground. We'd all like to feel very comfortable just sitting on it in a parking lot. But unfortunately, if you're really short, you're not going to be able to have a safe bike that you can do that on.
Yeah.
You can get a bike that's really confidence inspiring when you're not moving, but as soon as you start riding that thing, you're going to run out of suspension very quickly. In Japan, for example, they've got a lot of different bikes that we don't get here that are made because there's a lot of shorter people there that are wonderful, really cool bikes, both cruisers as well as sport bikes and everything in between, that are made for shorter people, and I shouldn't even say women, just shorter people in general, or smaller, lighter people in general. And unfortunately, we just, in the land of bigger is better, we don't get a lot of those bikes. And
No, we don't.
It's kind of a catch-22. They say, well, there's no market for that,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't bring any bikes in for there to be a market for that. And so a lot of people end up just doing what they can to get people to fit on them. Even I've got a girlfriend who's 5 foot on a good day and 100 pounds soaking wet, and man, we had to work really hard to get her BMW to fit her and still have the thing be safe to ride out on the road. And it took some fairly extensive modifications to the bike and even putting big extra soles on her boots, and she could just barely touch with the tips of her feet. But once she's going, she's very comfortable, and the bike is safe to ride, and so forth.
And I think one of the things, too, is a lot of people lower their bikes. And that can be a dangerous proposition if not done properly.
Right. Lowering your bikes can be great for drag racing, and it's pretty much terrible for everything else. And drag racing, where bikes are very apt, especially high horsepower ones, to flipping over backwards, you do want to get the center of gravity very low. And drag strips don't have any holes or bumps in them, so they really don't even hardly need suspension at all. So it's okay for bikes like that to get lowered, but if you just say, gee, I'd like to just have my feet more flat on the ground or be a little bit closer, you're always giving up safety and performance when you do that. There's a reason the bikes don't come that way.
Yeah.
It's because they're not safe to come that way.
Yeah, there's no ground clearance when you turn left or right either. Some of the cruisers have those issues too. I mean, we've looked at some of these bikes where there's very little lean angle available, especially if you get a heavier rider like myself on there, and the bikes are undersprung. And I see a lot of underdamped bikes on the large touring bikes and cruisers. And again, I think they think that that's what makes it plush. But when you bounce on the front end and it continues to bounce for another 3.5 minutes, that's not a good thing.
No, certainly not for, I mean, it will feel very plush over little tiny holes in the
Yeah.
ground, but everywhere else it's going to be a disadvantage for sure.
So really, to break this down, to improve your suspension, you're going to have, and I can say this from experience because before I got involved with Racetech and with you in Total Control, I had a basic understanding of it. And until I got my bike set up properly, well, now that I do, it is difficult for me to ride a bike that has not been set up right. I mean, okay.
Yeah, well, I think as Paul Thied put it best, the best you've ridden is the best you know.
Exactly.
And so if you've never been on a bike with good suspension, you wouldn't know that you were missing anything until you get that. And then you say, oh, wow, I didn't realize bikes could be that comfortable, or I didn't realize bikes could corner that well. And of course, some people I realize this is all technical jargon and they don't want to have to think about it so hard. And that's why we also do live classes. We've got our Total Control Advanced Riding Clinics where we actually teach this. We also do suspension seminars. Racetech does suspension seminars.
Sure.
Other people do suspension seminars. So it's always good to get some sort of knowledge from somebody who knows what they're talking about.
And I think the book is a great starting point. I think getting this book is the best starting point. But then you really do, and it's just, again, this is just my opinion because I feel you're going to get a lot more out of it, is to go out and take a class. I mean, I would certainly recommend your class because it's an amazing class. That I've been, dealing with you for years with the Total Control, and I love it. But find somebody who knows what they're doing regardless and learn and get hands-on and be there with them to have somebody show you. Because the experience of riding a bike with a good suspension, it completely changes your idea of what the motorcycle is supposed to be able to do. It makes it safer. It makes it more fun. I mean, and the reality is we don't ride. Well, some of us do maybe just ride to look cool, but the reality is we ride to enjoy the adventure and to enjoy the experience.
Right. Well, and I think a big misconception is a lot of people think, oh, well, if I'm going to the track or if I'm going to ride fast, the bike's got to be really, really stiff and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And if I just want to tour, it needs to be really soft and mushy. And in
Yeah.
fact, neither of those two things are really true. While
No.
it's true, it will be slightly stiffer, especially on things like compression damping when you're riding quickly on the track. The ideal settings really don't vary that much from one environment to the other, not in terms of a percentage, and given how far off so many bikes are, just the way that they come from the factory.
But it certainly makes a huge difference when the bike is in that sweet spot and when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And, you can say it and everybody's going to say, well, these manufacturers, they're really smart. They know what they're doing. They must know. The reality is there's a lot of compromises there. There's a lot of things that they do because of economic issues or because there's, like you said, they're setting it for a specific size rider or style of riding. And you want it to be set for you.
Right, and I think, and as someone who also makes motorcycle apparel,
Yeah.
I'm really big on the idea of what I call transparency, and
Yeah.
that is when it's working correctly, you shouldn't notice it at all.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite Taoist philosophers, a guy named Zhuangzi, said, "When the shoe fits, the foot is forgotten." So similarly, when your suspension works, the bike is forgotten.
Exactly.
And you can just enjoy the ride. You're not having to worry about the comfort and the traction and the performance as much as you do when you're having those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
And that's really why we ride, is for enjoyment.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously, we want to transport ourselves sometimes from A to B, and maybe we're getting the groceries or something. But ultimately, we choose motorcycles because it's a really enjoyable form of transportation.
And it's really it's an escape and it's an experience. And I want to try to explain to people, I don't know if anybody could eloquently enough explain the experience of riding a motorcycle better than the experience of riding a motorcycle.
Right.
Well,
The old adage is, if you have to ask, you wouldn't understand.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So you really need to go out. You need to go out there and experience it. Feel a bike that's been set up properly. It's going to be safer. It's going to be more comfortable. It's going to be a better experience, and it completely changes your mindset because we all go, I know what I'm doing. Especially, it's tough. The guy's been doing this 25 years. They've ridden 200, 300,000 miles. They know what they're talking about. But I can't tell you how many of those guys at the end of a class or the end of when they actually see it and they go, wow, I didn't know what I was missing.
Yeah.
So
You know who the most challenging students we have in the class are?
who's that?
Motor cops.
Motor cops.
Because they've been there, done that, know it all.
Ride
nothing
all the
else,
time.
Nothing, ride every day, 9 hours a day. What are you going to teach them in a parking lot?
Exactly.
And for the guys who are open-minded enough, they realize, wow, there's a whole lot you can learn.
Absolutely.
Right. And certainly there's a lot of stuff we could learn from what they've done. But they live in such a little insulated world of motorcycling
Yeah.
where they're just doing the same thing and things don't change very often in that community.
Yeah.
And so it's been a real eye-opener as we've been doing a lot more training for police departments, just like we do for the government with the
Yeah.
military, that, wow, there's a lot of stuff that we didn't know about. For instance, the police in most jurisdictions are not allowed to even adjust their suspension, strangely enough. So even if you're a 400-pound guy or a 100-pound person, you're not allowed to change the suspension settings from the way that they came. And
That's because a bureaucrat got involved.
exactly.
But yet there's other police departments that I know Race Tech has contracts with some police departments where they actually set up the bike specifically for that officer, which I think that should be every police department because that's a safety issue.
Right. Well, just
know?
like there's police departments where they're not allowed to wear earplugs, and then when the guys are 50, they're all wearing hearing aids because
Yeah.
you can't ride 9 hours a day without earplugs and keep your hearing.
Yeah, exactly. And they're wearing half helmets, which have
Right.
even more air noise and everything else. But I think the big thing here that I think people need to take away from this and anything that we do on Cycle Sports Radio is that keep yourself open-minded. You know, no matter how long you've been riding, no matter how many miles you have, is to open your mind to new stuff, and because you'd be amazed at how much you can learn. There's nobody out there in any field that can't learn something new. You know, and when you do, boy, I'll tell you what, especially the guys that have been doing it 25 years and all of a sudden they experience this new thing, they haven't experienced something new in a long time. And when they find that new thing, they find out, and we'll talk, you know, about the riding, your riding positions and body positions and everything else, that actually changes a lot of people as well. But once you find that new thing, you're like, wow, it lights a little light of inspiration in you.
Well, if there's one thing that the MSF got right, it was the idea that the more you know, the better it gets.
Absolutely.
Although I will warn all of your listeners here that when it comes to motorcycling, the more you know, the more you spend. So, unfortunately, as you learn more about riding, you're going to be spending more money on the equipment, on your gear, on your training.
We talked about that you are the perpetrator of some very expensive test rides.
Yes.
That you've handed over some machinery for people to ride, and after that, it cost them a lot of money.
Yeah, all I do is just try to share the fun. If someone feels the need to buy a new motorcycle after one of these things, well, that's unfortunately on them.
Well, Lee, I'm sure everybody wants to know how to get a hold of you, and there's multiple outlets for you. You know, obviously you have the book Total Control. How do they find you, and how do they get your book? And
All right,
or
so
books?
there's two websites to get a hold of us. For the training that we do, you can go to totalcontroltraining.net.
Okay.
And for the books, or we also manufacture really nice deerskin motorcycle gloves as well as a bunch of other products, you can go to leeparksdesign.com.
And they can get everything through Lee Parks Design, including sign up for classes as well. It'll take
Correct.
them to where they can sign up for the
Exactly.
classes. All right. Now, social media. Where are you in social media? How do they find you on Facebook, Twitter? Are there any?
Yeah, we've got both Lee Parks Design and Total Control Training, both on Facebook and Twitter. So just look us up there, and we'd appreciate a like if you like what you see there. And look forward to talking with people.
Absolutely. And we're all going to talk, another one of the shows we are going to talk about riding techniques, and I think that's important. As suspension is critically important for your motorcycle, your riding techniques are critically important for also the experience in your riding and the safety and your ability to make it from point A to point B, just to make it from point A to point B sometimes.
Yeah,
But-
well, the way that we look at training is there's really three areas that are going to make you a better rider.
Yeah.
Okay, there's the riding skills that we teach in the classes.
Sure.
There's the mental skills that we also teach, and this is making better judgments, making better decisions, not letting fear get a hold of you, knowing how to concentrate, having the right attitude. A lot of accidents happen not because someone didn't know how to go through a corner, but because they panicked or freaked out or target fixated. So the mental aspects of riding are just as important as the physical aspects. And the third aspect is what we talked about today, which is the mechanical aspects of riding. So things like suspension, things like tires, all the things, fueling. I'm sure you'll have episodes on, getting the carburation or the fuel injection set up correctly for your motorcycle, because even if everything else is good, if that's screwed up, that can cause a problem. If your tires are old or have issues or are not the right tires for the bike, that can also cause a crash. So those are really the three areas, though: riding skills, mental skills, and mechanical skills.
And I'll tell you, as many of the classes as I've taken and have taught as well, because I've been fortunate enough to be on the other side as well, the more that I learn, the more that I want to learn, because you get out there and you realize how enjoyable it is when you are able to take yourself beyond that point. And when you get out on the road, how much better an experience it is, how much more comfortable you feel, how much more confident you feel. And although today we were talking about suspension and how much that does, because trust me, especially for me, it does quite a bit. Being able to ride the bike properly and be able to apply those techniques makes a big difference. But Lee, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. It's been a great show, and I hope everybody out there got a lot out of this. Lots of great resources. We also have a video up on our site on how to set sag if you want. We're going to do a better one here in the next coming months. But make sure to get a hold of Lee. Get the book, Total Control. At least get Total Control. Start there. The Suspension Bible, if you're feeling like you want to start doing some servicing, go for that, because I use that every time I crack open my forks. That book is sitting next to me. Trust me, because it helps me with everything. Lee, thanks again. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for listening to Cycle Sports Radio. Don't forget to check us out on YouTube at youtube.com/cyclesportstv. And you can also check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Cycle Sports TV. And you can actually download the show. If you didn't get it on iTunes, it is available on iTunes as well. So thanks again, folks, and we'll hopefully talk to you real soon.